Hey y'all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the Cubot X90. This is a pretty stylish and affordably priced unlocked Android smartphone that retails for $250, sometimes goes on sale closer to $200, and it shares very similar design as well as hardware as the Hafuri Meet, which is a sub-brand of Cubot that debuted a couple months back. And what made this phone a bit special was its very deluxe presentation for a similar budget price. It included two different cases, one which is geared a little bit more towards women with a lanyard strap, providing an alternative to the Xiaomi CV series of also fashion-focused phones geared more towards women. But the Cubot X90, on the other hand, is kind of geared towards everyone. They've gone with more conservative-looking colorways, as well as no longer having a kind of fashion case in the box. So it strips back maybe some of those gimmicks to appeal to a wider audience, with slightly upgraded specs, including 16 gigabytes of built-in RAM versus 12 gigabytes of RAM on the Hafuri Meet, in addition to a very clean version of Android 14 as the OS compared to Android 13 on the Hafuri Meet. So again, slight incremental improvements, but the overall design and feel is quite similar as still a very slim and petite smartphone, actually quite different from their usual rugged devices that Cubot is more well known for, trading that for a sleeker, all-round experience inclusive of a 6.7-inch Full HD Plus resolution 120Hz ultra-fast refresh rate OLED panel, which is also slightly curved on the edges. Now, that might be a little bit controversial for fans of flat displays, but it undoubtedly makes the phone look and feel a little bit more expensive than the budget price would otherwise imply. And for a phone of its size, it's also relatively light at around 207 grams. On the rear, we have a 100 megapixel main camera, assisted by a 16 megapixel ultra-wide-angle lens, a 5 megapixel macro lens for close-up shots, as well as another lens for depth sensing for bokeh portrait effects. So actually, the hardware is not bad. Again, 16 megapixel ultra-wide-angle is a little bit sharper than the norm in budget phones being around 8 megapixels. So hopefully you don't end up with as soft-looking images, and the macro lens, although I would have preferred telephoto for close-up zoom, 5 megapixels again is also a little bit sharper than the typical 1 to 2 megapixels that we often frown upon on many other low-end devices. It's also flanked by a dual-tone LED flash and a pretty prominent camera ring, which is crafted out of aluminum alloy. There are two colors to pick between, a black version here as well as a green, and they're all treated in terms of the glass to have an interesting granite-like texture that also resembles maybe mountains if you're looking at it from a certain angle. And other quick top-line specs include 256 gigabytes of built-in storage by default, also a little bit higher compared to the 128 gigabyte base model for the Hafuri Meet. So again, just a little bit more RAM as well as storage space, which is great. That can be further augmented using the dual SIM card slot that can also hold a second micro SD card if you need even more storage. By the way, the RAM can also be further bumped up to 32 gigabytes if you're using 16 gigs of the ROM to act as virtual RAM to give you some expanded multitasking capabilities, and there's a pretty large 5,100 milliamp hour capacity battery that can charge up at 33 watts, so it only takes around an hour or so to juice back up, which is also quite good. As for connectivity, we have Wi-Fi, built-in Bluetooth, as well as NFC for contactless mobile payment, although there is no Qi wireless charging. That's kind of the norm these days, and there's also built-in GPS as well. That being said, this is a 4G LTE phone as opposed to 5G. And that's partly because the processor they're using here is the MediaTek Helio G99, again, similar to the Hafuri Meet from before. So it's by no means the fastest processor in the world, but it's a decent budget/mid-range option that at least is quite energy efficient. And it's manufactured on the TSMC facilities as a 6nm chipset, so with the large battery inside, it mostly gets through about 2 days of use before you have to recharge it again. That being said, again, if you are looking at the GPU, it's obviously going to be weaker than newer and more powerful chips compared to something like a Qualcomm, let's say 8th Gen series processor. It also has an under-display fingerprint scanner for unlocking, offers decent speed, although the position is a little bit lower at the bottom section of the screen, but overall, I would say not too problematic. Just a closer look at the design and hardware. On the right-hand spine, you'll find access to the power key that's slightly textured green, and then on the Left-hand spine, there's access to the volume rocker that feels relatively tactile and responsive. The frame of the device is built out of polycarbonate plastic, but doesn't feel too cheap. It has a good density to it to kind of simulate the feeling of metal. And then on the very top, it has a tapered edge that consists of a microphone, as well as an IR blaster for controlling home appliances. Unfortunately, though, the X90 does not have a standard 3.5mm headphone jack anymore. And then last but not least, on the very bottom edge, you'll find the aforementioned dual SIM card / micro SD slot, the USB Type-C port for charging, data transfer, as well as the loudspeaker. Now this is a single speaker setup, unfortunately, so there is no stereo unit on this particular device. It might be one of the improvements for them to work on as they continue making more of these lifestyle catered phones in the future. Again, a bit of a departure for this brand that has historically focused on just rugged devices. As for packaging, even though, again, it's lighter compared to the Hafuri Meet, you still get plenty of goodies, all things considered. For example, there is a 33-watt fast charger using USB Type-C included, along with the SIM ejector pin and cable. What's really thoughtful here is they also give you a curved tempered glass screen protector, because as you guys know, with curved screens, fitting a film protector can be quite tough due to that kind of curved edges. So this will allow it to stick a little bit better and still give you slightly higher resistance. And last but not least, a transparent, hard plastic case is also included for some added protection on the outside shell that snaps into place while still allowing you to make out the gradient finish on the back of the phone. Software-wise, we are greeted to, again, a very clean version of Android 14 out of the box, and you are left with over 233 gigabytes of space when you're first setting it up, and there's no bloatware on here at all, aside from just the regular Google utilities. You'll find just a helpful voice recorder built in by Cubot, and that is pretty much it. Everything else has been left nearly completely stock, as you can tell here. That being said, when it comes to future OS level upgrades, that's always a slightly tricky area when it comes to smaller manufacturers, and it's not guaranteed that we'll get pushed anything further than Android 14, although security updates and patches will be provided over the air. So hopefully that's an area that more of these companies can be cautious of going into the future, but it is what it is, kind of a trade-off of getting a lower cost device. Now here's a quick size comparison with some other, I would say, curved screen phones of a similar footprint, including the OnePlus 7 Pro from a couple years back. Of course, the OnePlus was a flagship grade device, but you can tell how Cubot has definitely taken inspiration in trying to make this thing just look and feel more expensive than the price here would imply. And another device that we've reviewed recently has been the new B30 Pro, which is actually very similar when it comes to overall hardware specs, as well as a similar class display, again 6.7 inches, also curved and OLED at 120 Hz, just a slightly different treatment when it comes to the finish on the rear. But it makes me suspect that perhaps they're using kind of similar, maybe factories for manufacturing, just choosing a slightly different shell. But regardless, it's great to see that some of these smaller players and brands are starting to incorporate OLED screens with fast refresh rates and a pretty impressive screen-to-body ratio, again, that looks super vibrant, and it's going to be great for content consumption and media in general that we usually had to pay at least a couple $100s more to get in the past. Final comparisons here, this one is the Sharp Aquos R6, also very similar size to the R7. It's one of the first Android devices with a 1-inch type sensor camera on the rear, produced in collaboration with Leica. It's much more of a flagship grade camera phone, but you can tell that Cubot also kind of took inspiration by making that camera module larger. The drag-down notification shade also is extremely clean, with no real traces of customization going on. You can bring up live caption and ultra dim mode for the screen, and that's pretty much it. In some ways, though, it might be even too barren because you aren't able to swipe down with your fingers like so to bring down the notification shade. You have to press all the way there at the top corner, which for a slightly larger screen, again 6.7 inches, I do think they should have added that custom gesture. But it is what it is. If we jump into more advanced settings, you can find a couple of smart controls, including the ability for you to screen record, as well as 3 fingers swiping down on the display to capture a screenshot. Some of those quick controls you're able to find, and you can also revert back to a button navigation menu if you want that instead of the gesture nav method here. Under memory expansion, again, we have the ability to toggle this on to augment that with 16 gigabytes of virtual RAM, and under display properties, you can also turn down the refresh rate to, say, a standard 60 Hz or give it into auto if you want to preserve a longer battery performance. You can also change some of the color and saturation properties, including a natural mode that looks like this versus the boosted, as well as a saturated mode, and you can see how that differs from profile to profile, as well as an adaptive mode that will change depending on the content that you're looking at. You can also activate a pocket mode that will prevent accidental triggers when you're putting the phone into your pocket. It will recognize that using the proximity light sensor, and also, by the way, up top here is going to be that earpiece, along with a 32 megapixel front-facing camera. Aside from this, you also get Dura speed on board. Similar to other MediaTek-powered phones, it's able to turbo the processing speed to the maximum that the phone is capable of when you're accessing certain apps, for example, gaming. And you can also have a scheduled power on and off. So if you want the device to automatically turn on in the mornings, for example, and shut down at night to, for example, preserve more battery, you can set it up like this using the automated drawer down below. I'll also mention that by default, the phone actually has the swipe up menu drawer here disabled, but you can bring that back just by long holding, go into home settings, and then for launcher style you can choose the app drawer or the regular, which just pushes unlimited home pages instead. So that is based on your own preferences. And in terms of wallpapers, we also get a couple built in by Cubot that kind of shows off the vibrancy of the panel. As you can tell, they're super saturated and very vibrant looking. Similar again to the new B30 Pro that we reviewed previously. It is one of the, I think, higher quality panels that you can find in a $200 phone, for a new device at least at the moment. Quite immersive. Brightness is also satisfactory. It may not be as bright as, say, an iPhone Pro Max, but in most conditions, especially in some shade and indoors, you really won't find too many issues. Now jumping into the camera next, this is one aspect where budget devices tended to struggle with in the past in terms of camera processing. And on here, I would say that stereotype still mostly holds. However, you do have decent hardware, so when you are in sufficient lighting, you can still get some pretty sharp-looking results. The UI is pretty simple to navigate, although interestingly enough, from the regular picture mode by default, you're not able to pinch out to go into the ultra-wide angle camera taking mode. You have to actually swipe over to the final tab here under more to go into a wide angle. So I do think they should bring that back as one of the quick shortcuts when you are in the regular tab over here for easier control. But regardless, you do have a dedicated option here for Ultra HD, aka capturing it at the 100 megapixel mode. You can also record video up to 2K resolution, and you can cycle through some of the resolution options down below. In the normal profile, you can also switch on HDR, although that's not going to be found if you're using it at the 100 megapixel mode, and also choose between some other aspect ratios, including 4:3. Interestingly enough, the ultra-wide 16:9 only becomes available if you scale it down to 12 megapixels, but there's also a 25 megapixel mode that you can activate from here. You can go into the portrait bokeh effect, changing the intensity of the blur, a night view mode that will slightly increase the exposure time to capture more details when you are in darker environments. And last but not least, under more, I'll also say that there is a pro mode for changing properties like ISO and white balance in a more granular fashion, and you also have the ability to change that into a QR code barcode scanner, as well as activate the macro close-up mode as well. So taking a quick look at some of the images, again, under good enough lighting conditions with that primary sensor, even under the regular 12 megapixels or 25 megapixel mode, you can still get some pretty clean looking results that are attractive enough from a color perspective, even though there isn't kind of an AI filter on top, some of those modes that other manufacturers are playing with. I think the HDR is, for the most part, good enough to get you satisfying looking results, again, in nicely lit conditions, that is. Focusing doesn't seem problematic either. Keep in mind though that this is a phone that doesn't have any OIS on board, only electronic image stabilization, so when you are in darker conditions, you do have to hold relatively still. And that night mode, even though it's better than not having it, you can see the colors at least are a little bit brighter. It's still not going to be to Pixel or iPhone levels, of course, at the end of the day. There will be a little bit more blurriness if you aren't holding completely still, but that gives you an example of what that mode looks like. Here's also some comparisons between a regular image that is captured in the 25 megapixel mode with HDR off versus HDR on. So you notice that the saturation of the sky just seems a little bit more vibrant, and perhaps more importantly, in some of the shadows here, we are able to notice just a little bit more detail getting retained. So HDR does make a difference. And again, this is the 100 megapixel mode, so that's going to take up the largest space, around 60 megabytes, compared to, say, 18 megabytes if you're taking it with 25 megapixels. pixels, and you can tell the difference here is you can zoom and crop just a little bit more and be able to still notice more fine details this way, versus this is the maximum that you can zoom in a regular 25 megapixel photo. Here's also the ultra wide angle in practice, so you are able to get more within the frame of the shot, including trees, and it looks decent, I would say. Definitely not quite as sharp as the regular primary camera. That being said, at least it doesn't have too much distortion on the edges that curve off too dramatically, though it is a little soft on some of those edges there. But again, it still is a useful lens when you're trying to, again, get more within your image and not have to stand as far back. So a decent set of cameras on here, I would say, that's mostly expected for a budget phone of its class, and will get you by as long as you have your expectations tempered. Now, when it comes to the haptic vibration motor, it's also an area, again, similar to those previous devices, is a little bit on the weaker side, not quite as tight as on true flagships, but we'll get the job done. Here's also a quick example of how video consumption works if we crank up the speakers and hear what it sounds like. So takeaway is it's not bad and definitely gets sufficiently loud, but obviously there isn't that stereo separation that would have been even better. And again, there's no standard headphone jack, but you are able to use any wireless Bluetooth headphones. Again, the screen really is the highlight here. Colors are just so vibrant and inky black when it comes to contrast levels with wide viewing angles that just makes it a very enjoyable experience. Slim bezels that are nearly symmetrical as well are all aspects that you'll appreciate when using this device. And when it comes to antenna reception quality, I think the plastic frame is also helping because I was able to stay connected quite well, even though we're a little bit further from the router right now using dual band Wi-Fi or 4G LTE. And thankfully, buffering isn't something you have to worry too much about. Things load up quite quickly. Picture-in-picture also works nicely too, and you are able to do a little bit of multitasking. The Helio G99, again, is a very energy-efficient chip, so I didn't really notice any signs of thermal throttling or the device even getting too warm, aside from when it was installing a lot of software updates. So in general, performance has been pretty consistent, and again, good enough for media consumption purposes. Here's also a quick example of how it fares if we are loading back, let's say, a web page, and again, testing it out here by jumping into something like The Verge, more complex sites with more video elements, as well as, again, more information on the page in general, still seem to be doing a pretty respectable job. And the RAM on here, I think, is also an aspect that I do appreciate them giving you 16 gigabytes of true RAM out of the box. Again, augmented up to 32 gigs, you're able to jump easily between more than a dozen applications, as well as tabs in the browser, and in my testing, it was still quite good in terms of preserving that in the background. So the optimization has been done fairly well. Now, when it comes to the basics, again, the sound reception quality was quite good. In addition to the microphone does have a bit of ambient noise reduction. I found it still pretty easy to communicate as well as hear the other person. My voice also sounded clear to them on the other end. And when it comes to doing a bit of light gaming, I would say the emphasis here is going to be on light. There is nothing from the store that you aren't able to install, again, using this Helio G99 chip, but some of the graphic settings you may have to slightly lower for a faster experience on heavier titles on, say, Minecraft or PUBG, but they will still be playable at the end of the day, especially after they open up. It may take a couple seconds longer at the beginning, but once it starts to actually play, you can tell it's still a okay enough experience. Just don't expect it to be a true gamer phone, and I think you'll be mostly content. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Cubot X90. Again, it's basically a rebranded version of the Hufuri Meet in terms of specs as well as design, but with slightly more RAM inside, and again, it's not quite as catered exclusively for women anymore. And although it's not going to be perfect, I do think it's a pretty decent choice as a budget phone here in 2024, especially as one of the first attempts by a rugged phone brand to, again, diversify and just make more attractive devices that might appeal to a wider audience. And for this device in particular, I would say as long as you aren't expecting the fastest GPU, it is surprisingly capable when it comes to everyday use, pretty smooth when navigating around the UI, again, beautiful display as well as quite an eye-catching design, build and finish as well. So you can check out more details if you are interested in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Cubot X90